Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lindsay Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the California Cannabis Industry Association. We're really excited to bring this panel to you today to discuss local tax measures. Everyone knows that there's a huge election coming up, just less than 2 weeks away, and there's a lot at stake, both local, state, and on the national level. So we're going to be talking a little bit about ballot measures, especially that are affecting taxes, but really just want to do, a get out the vote as well and make sure folks are staying engaged. So welcome. We're really excited that you all could join us. This is being recorded, so it can also be used as a resource on our website. If anyone has questions during the webinar, you can feel free to shoot them to me and our guy behind the scenes, Eddie, who's helping to administer everything on the back end. And we'll either try to weave them in throughout the conversation with our panelists, or we'll get to them at the end. So wonderful. We're really excited that you could join us today. Again, my name is Lindsay Robinson, Executive Director of CCIA. For those of you who don't know, CCIA is a trade association. We represent legal cannabis businesses across the state and every aspect of legal cannabis. We mostly primarily focus on state level lobbying, but we also do federal and local. So we're excited to bring this really stellar group of folks together for a panel discussion. So I'm gonna read off who they are and their titles, and they'll say a quick word about themselves, and then we can dive right in. So first off, we have Fran Mancia, who's the Vice President of Government Relations at Muni Services and Avenue Insights. Fran, say hello.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here. We have the pleasure to work with local governments as they try to educate their communities as well as implement taxation and opening up businesses to their communities. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thanks so much, Fran. Next up, we have Dr. Julie Crockett, Director of Compliance at MMLG and a CCIA board member, and also a CCIA DICE committee member. Welcome, Julie.
Hello, and thank you for having me. Yes, as the Director of Compliance for MMLG, I have the opportunity to work with licensees across the supply chain to help build internal compliance systems, and also through my role on the board at CCIA and with the Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity Committee, I get to work with the government agencies, localities, and cannabis operators and workers to try to make sense of what we're in.
Thank you so much, Julie. Happy to have you. Next up, we have James Anthony, who's the principal at Anthony Law Group, as well as a CCIA board member. James, say hello.
Hey there. Yes, I have been a cannabis and local government lawyer since 2006. Right after I got out of the Oakland City Attorney's Office, where I was a zoning prosecutor. I have the dubious distinction of having provoked the first ever local tax on cannabis business in modern history, which was the 1.8% tax in Oakland, passed by the voters in 2008, which is 15 times the regular business tax in Oakland.
Great, thanks, James. I'm going to be asking you to expand on that a little bit later on in our webinar. And last but certainly not least, Amber Morris, Director of Government Affairs at NorCal Cannabis Company. Amber, welcome.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks for having me, and thank you for covering this really important topic. I'm lucky to work with the team at NorCal, and I spend my days immersed in policy, trying to figure out how we can get a more fair and smart California cannabis industry based on policy. It's a full-time job for sure. We've been focused a lot on state, and I think a lot of us are disappointed at how the last legislative session turned out, but with COVID, we're really turning our attention to local policy, and taxes are gonna be really big coming up next year, especially with the economics we're seeing. So excited to talk about local taxes.
Yes, I mean, as excited as we can be, right? As many of you know, tax reform and tax reduction has been, one of the top priorities for CCIA for the last several years. We represent all different types of businesses, and we get to hear the pain points and the struggles that they face in this legal industry. And so taxes are a complicated landscape. I think most people don't find taxes enjoyable to talk about or learn about or understand, but it is absolutely vital for us to do deep dives like this, especially into local taxes, because I think that's one of the more complicated pieces. And they really do affect the industry in a pretty significant way. So why don't we just jump right into to our first section here, and we want to talk a little bit about what makes for good or bad tax policy. So I'm going to turn it over to Amber first to talk a little bit about how local taxes work in terms of throughout the supply chain. So take it away, Amber.
Yeah, so I think to set the stage, we'll talk a little bit first about what the local tax measures look like. So what we're seeing mostly on this year's ballots is that the locals are putting a tax on the ballot. They can't actually raise taxes without getting approval by their constituents, which is a wonderful protection we have here in California. But what they're doing is they're, in most cases, they're establishing a maximum tax rate for the industry. Sometimes they're dividing it up by license type. Sometimes they're doing a square footage versus a gross receipts tax. But basically, this is giving them flexibility to adjust the actual rate at the local level. So from my perspective, good tax policy, I always look at the end game first. And the end game here is we want to be like every other business in California. So how do we get there? I think it's really important that we start with measures that are getting approved that do have the flexibility to actually go down to nothing. I think it's critical. And unfortunately, we're starting to see on the ballots minimum percentages of gross receipts instead of just a max. So I think, first of all, we need to think of like how we have flexibility within what is getting passed to go to the end game, which is not actually having a cannabis specific tax. Some things that I've seen locally that I think are smart policy. In San Francisco, you can only adjust the rate by 1% every year. So I think it's really great to have a cap where, you know, locals might have difficult decisions to make based on their budgets, but not have the flexibility to find cannabis as the answer to plug those holes. So I think limiting what can happen. San Francisco also has a really smart policy where when taxes are raised, they don't go into effect immediately. So the businesses have an opportunity to adjust to what may be coming in the next calendar year. I think having knowns for both the business and for the local municipality is important. So we've seen the different types, especially in cultivation, with a square footage tax versus gross receipts tax. I think gross receipts is compounded through the supply chain, and square footage, as long as it's simple and understandable, it makes sense where a business is able to know what they're putting out every quarter, or, you know, a half a year. So I think, I mean, those are just some examples of what I've seen as good smart policy. And the city of Santa Rosa also, they set a tax limit. I'm sorry, their tax rates, and they stay in place for 2 years. So that's a double-edged sword. If you have bad rates, it's there for 2 years. If you have good rates, you're at least locked in. So we are lucky in Santa Rosa where it's locked in at a good rate. So I'll stop there, but there's lots of ways this can be actually created, crafted to have as minimal impact as possible.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's quite a bit of local control, which maybe, Fran, you could touch on just a little bit for us.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And first of all, I want to thank Amber for great comments. We've had the pleasure working with the city of Santa Rosa from the inception and all across the board. And I think you hit it on the head. There's a city that, for example, that really understands the industry. There's compassion for the industry based on some of the experiences of council members. The community was engaged. You know, we encourage cities to not just look at the tax perspective, and when you do, they'll keep that at the low end. A lot of them like the ranges simply because they don't have to go back to council and go out to set a new rate, so they like the range, but always best to be at the lowest end possible. Just on gross receipts, many of them like that simply because they tax their other businesses on gross receipts. So, but it's compounded in this industry, obviously, because of the large state tax rates and the other fees that are associated. But the local control thing really comes, I think, more from a lack of understanding for many people, or fear of the industry, the unknown. So they tend to be a little more rigid. They don't want, frankly, they don't want to be the first one off the bench. You know, they want to see what happens elsewhere. Now you're starting to see others getting educated. Oh, this isn't a terrible group of people. These are good, responsible business people, no different than any other business in our community. So we need to be treating everyone the same way. So I think it's an educational piece, but I think a lot of that local control is out of fear and unknown. And so I think there's a lot of things we can do to develop relationships and ease that up over time. Hope, Lindsay, that kind of gets to where you're looking to go with that question, that point about local control.
Yeah, thank you. James, do you want to add in a little bit of a context for overview?
Oh, I don't know. I think we've covered it. Has to be done by the voters. The city council can put it on. Usually that's how it's done. They almost always pass, usually around 80%. It's only people, I think, who smoke pot who vote against these taxes, so about 20% of the population. Everybody else is all, yeah, tax them. So I know we're looking, and we're going to look over the next, 45 minutes or so at what's on the ballot coming up, right now in a couple of weeks, and even now as we're voting. But there's 548 local governments in California, and more of them are going to come on board. And so you're going to see more of them again in 2022. So if you don't like the one that passes wherever you are, then start another one next door and help them write it for 2022. And as we go along, we'll help you learn how to, get them to do a good job so that they can beat the city next door, because this is what cities do. They compete with each other for business tax revenue, and you need to use that to your advantage.
Great. Well, I think this segues well into talking about local access and the struggles that the state is facing because there are so few jurisdictions that are actually allowing commercial cannabis activity and even less that are allowing retail. So Julie, I would love to ask you a little bit about that particular subject, and also maybe you could weave in some of the vapey issues that we saw last year coming out of the illicit market.
Indeed. I just wanted to say, I'm not sure, did we get into the bad part of taxation a lot? Because I don't think we got to touch on, just before we move on, I'd like to touch on how criminally horrible it is to tax cannabis businesses on gross receipts, which is the standard, and that in itself causes so many problems in the supply chain. Not only are you dealing with a business that's already crippled by 280E and the inability to write off normal, things that other businesses do. So you're operating at a very low profit margin in the first place, and that gross receipts gives a very distorted sense of how much money a business is making. I know that this is a common thing for simplicity's sake for municipalities, that they want that steady number without all the deductions that they can base their tax rate on. But it's really problematic for operators, especially operators who are generally coming into the business already deeply indebted because they've had to take on so much investment capital to start their business. Then they're dealing with federal tax penalties via 280E and other problematic taxes. And then especially the issue of tax pyramiding, which is where, because of the way gross receipts tax is calculated, you have the ability to tax every single transaction along the supply chain. So you have one business venture of the journey of the plant from seed to sale being taxed multiple times for the same product across the supply chain. So I just really want to emphasize that is a model that I would love to see change as we get more comfortable with the concept of cannabis and the way that cannabis businesses are run, and they're able to kind of be taxed in accordance with other businesses. So with that said, local access.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Local access. So I'd love to kind of think about how that dynamic plays in, especially with the competitive kind of nature of businesses that James was talking about and the current dynamic with local access. And then we can hit some individual measures that are going to be coming up and discuss those.
Well, I think it's important, when we look at the landscape of California, as James was saying, there's 548, local governments of cities and counties, and still we're just inching over I think that 1/3 mark of you still have of only about 1/3 of those having any kind of active cannabis ordinance in place. So just within the scope of the state, of the great state of California, we see very few, comparatively less than half of our municipalities with active cannabis programs of providing access to consumers and patients in their localities. And some of this, I think it's important to go back on a historical note, is that back in 2016, when we were just still having our medical cannabis, but at that time still calling it marijuana, Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act was being contemplated and passed October of 2016, I think it was. It's hysterical to me that the state came back and said it was a typo, but in that ordinance there was a statement that said that local governments had until March 1st to set their own rules, and if they didn't, then the state would automatically become the sole licensing authority for cannabis companies in their municipality. So that was kind of some of the cause for what became statewide panic with municipalities to hurry up and enact something before that March 1st cutoff. And the easiest thing that they were being advised by different sources to enact was a ban. So that's kind of where the hole we find ourselves digging ourselves out of, was this mass banning across many cities and counties triggered by that. And even though the state came out and tried to explain it was a mistake and issued emergency measures to say, no, it didn't work, and we still have all these counties banning. So that in itself is one of the problems. And then for the municipalities that do have any sort of an ordinance, you have a lot of issues of scarcity, very limited caps, very competitive processes in terms of, we call them beauty contests, of people hiring design firms and all sorts of consultants to create these proposals to compete, which really puts small business owners, equity candidates at a real disadvantage in these competitions, where there's a lot of money flowing in, a lot of competition for real estate, and just kind of the perfect storm for extortion and predatory practices on every level, from real estate to local government, that it gets into a real bad situation by creating in many ways an unnecessary economy of scarcity around these licenses.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to weave in some questions that we're getting from our audience. Please feel free to keep sending them. If we don't get to them within the general content, we'll have a special Q&A towards the end, but continue to send them. So on that point, I do think, right, so we're talking about how much local taxes play into the passage of these ordinances, right? And we know that there are still a significant number, 1/3 or 1/4 are actually have ordinances on the books, so the rest do not. And we know that the illicit industry is thriving in many of those places. And I do want to just touch on a little bit how I think that those illicit markets played into some real public health issues and public safety issues. And so while we are excited, I think, to see more ordinances on the ballot for 2020, we want to be cautious, I think, in overtaxing an industry that is still maturing. Within the legal space. And so I think that's part of what we want to explore here is that we know that it's important to pass these measures, but the measures also need to be thoughtful and smart and really encourage businesses to actually grow within their communities, because certainly during this kind of economic turmoil that the state is facing because of COVID and the pandemic, that also creates a lack of access point. So just kind of wanted to note a couple of those things before we transition into some of the good and the bad that we're seeing on the local measures currently.
Yeah, I think that's, oh, sorry. I was just
No,
gonna say,
please, Julie, go ahead.
I've left out that piece of what a critical time that was when the Vapey Valley crisis broke out. And it was in such a horrible situation, if there could be said to be a silver lining. One of them was that it was made abundantly clear that the licensed industry was not part of that problem, and that in fact, I know Leafly did a study based on available data, and it was shown that there was 10 times the rate of injury from Vapey Valley in localities that did not have access to licensed tested cannabis than the ones that did. And there were also not a single instance of those that were impacted and injured by that in which they were shown to have exclusively bought any kind of cannabis product from the licensed industry. So it really did highlight the critical nature of access to safe, licensed, tested cannabis. And it was a big moment of the cannabis industry kind of coming together, and I do think that had a tremendous impact as well on when we did enter the pandemic, of cannabis being declared an essential service and an essential medicine. And that was another moment where the industry really came together, because it wasn't clear there for a moment, and there was some shaky starts where some municipalities told businesses to close, and it happened in Denver where there was panic among consumers and patients, and lines around the corner of people thinking of being unsure what their access was going to be like, and then realizing, not only that this is an opportunity for the industry to really get a foothold, the licensed industry. One of the things of that Valley crisis was that it kind of did the public information campaign that the agencies didn't, in terms of clarifying for consumers what is the distinction between the licensed and unlicensed industry. Because at that time, for the average person on the street, there's not a lot of clarity on how do I tell the difference, other than it's cheaper here and it's more expensive here, because a lot of those public information campaigns that the agencies were supposed to be responsible for weren't that great. weren't really reaching the end user very well.
Sorry, I had muted myself. Thanks for that, Julie. I really appreciate that. Well, let's dig into this first slide. Fran, I would love for your feedback. And again, for folks who are just joining, feel free to shoot us questions. We're going to try to weave them into the content or grab them at the end, but we're happy that you're here. So Fran.
Yeah, first of all, just a couple of quick comments as we look at each of these measures. I'm a real believer that there is not a one-size-fits-all model for jurisdictions and what they look for and how they operate. They're all really different. And I think, unfortunately, we have had a very canned approach in many ways in terms of the process, the selection, setting the rates. That's not something we do or report. I think that's part of the challenge, to add on to what Julie and others talked about earlier. So just from that perspective, if you look at Measure G, I always believe we should have an establishment of storefront and non-storefront use. The broader the reach, the better. I'm not a big fan of having a 4% minimum and a high of 7%. Everything we've worked on has gone from 0 or 1 or 2% up. It's a little bit high, and I think it sets a different tone. I'm assuming this tells me that the community is more interested in revenues, not so much the business relationship with the industry. So that's a concern to me. When you see a lower rate, I think that means it's going to be more collaborative and equal. This signals that this is about money, to be real blunt.
I want to jump in on this one too.
Yeah, go for it.
So Costa Mesa, Orange County is, pretty much closed off to legal cannabis. Santa Ana is the exception, which is the neighbor of Costa Mesa. So Costa Mesa is seeing Santa Ana have a successful legal market, and they're eyeing it from that perspective, which I think is something that we'll start seeing more and more in California, is that with experience of the local municipalities, especially with neighbors, they see it working. They see those fears that some of the initial bans were based on not coming to fruition. So I think Costa Mesa is a really good example of a council who has seen a successful legal market next door and wants to jump in. I don't like minimum
Yeah.
of 4%, though. It's terrible.
And just to follow up on
And
Amber's
something
comment.
we do see is we see mirroring a lot. So a lot of cities will look and say, oh, that's a good idea. So we really need to get rid of these minimums quickly.
Yeah, and just if I may to add into Amber's comment, having worked with Anna and we oversaw their selection process, and we'll be doing their audit soon. There's a very different approach. It's a different demographic in the community, and I think they've done it better. But this one gives me a little angst again because it left out the part about starting at a lower rate.
Yeah, and I wanted to also draw something that you said, Fran, about businesses building relationships within the communities that are looking to tax. I think that's a really vital piece of it. And I know, James, you have done quite a bit around your work in Oakland on that. I mean, I think it's important for these businesses to be part of the conversation. And I think oftentimes, again, the mirroring or what is seen as kind of the industry standard doesn't necessarily take into account how important those relationships are, and really how crucial it is to be encouraging growth of these businesses, because without that, you're going to have the illicit industry still thriving. These businesses could be almost taxed out of existence, and really all they're doing is trying to work within the compliance of that city. So I think that's an important dynamic. So James, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, as I mentioned, there will be more in 2022. What you're going to get this year, you're going to be stuck with that language. So, whether you're in a jurisdiction that is about to pass a tax, or in one that hasn't done one yet, but maybe some of the neighbors are starting to do it, you need to start developing relationships with your local government. And part of that is relationships with elected and their staff, the city council members or the board of supervisors if you're an unincorporated county, and the people who work directly in their offices. But especially in smaller cities, what's even more important is having some kind of relationship with the city staff, right? Small cities are run by city managers. They're not run by the mayor and the city council, right? The city manager is a professional administrator. They supposedly know how to run a city, and then they have a planning director, and they got a police chief, they got a revenue director, and those are the people who really kind of set the agenda and sort of put some options on the plate for the city council. And then often they will go out and hire an outside consultant. And for, they will be talking to that consultant who will have an agenda, which will be clear because they're a matter of public record, right? You can see the kinds of things that Muni Services has worked on, as Fran was mentioning. There are some other competing consultants who've worked on some things that are, shall we say, evolving and hopefully getting better. But you are competing for their attention. So especially if you're a local person, a local business person, or a local resident, or a local patient, because patients are still very, very persuasive. You need to be establishing those relationships and helping them to write their tax policy in the context of how much are the neighbors charging, and explaining to them that places like Santa Rosa and Long Beach and Emeryville are successful in obtaining large industries that create occupancy for real estate, commercial and industrial real estate, that is sitting around vacant because half of your economy is crashing. They create jobs for local people, and those jobs involve payroll, and payroll gets spent on gas and groceries and babysitters, and then people go back to work. So all that money stays local. So those are wonderful economic benefits long before we get to taxes. And so if you want those benefits, you need an attractive policy, not only a reasonable tax rate, but also reasonable regulations, reasonable zoning, and there's absolutely no reason to have any kind of limit or cap on the number of cannabis businesses, especially non-retail, right? Maybe you can make an argument for the number of storefronts, but there's no reason to limit supply chain. Supply chain has a statewide market. There's no reason to limit delivery. Delivery is delivering into all of your neighboring competitors who are too stupid to allow cannabis businesses. So you're going to go in there, steal their customers, steal their sales tax. You know, cities know how to do this. They know how to steal tax from each other. If they're not sure, they can ask Fran. He will explain it to them. It's, you know, there's a step-by-step process.
There's competition, yeah.
That's who you need to become, is part of the local process. And if you start right now, you might actually have some useful effects coming into 2022.
Yeah.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. One thing I did want to bring up, that which ties into a question here, is the you brought up patients. Can we talk about the difference before we go any further on taxation for medical cannabis and adult use? Who wants that one? Amber?
Well, they both have to pay.
Sure,
the
I can
excise
jump in.
All right, Amber first, then Julie.
Looking at I think there's 25 tax related measures. I think there was only a couple who actually called out the exemption for medical cannabis locally. So in the municipalities that we operate in, both Long Beach and Santa Ana do have a different rate, but it's not zero for medical, it's different. So yeah, I am seeing that whole policy area kind of being baked out, which is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Julie, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just back to that historical view is, I mean, I think one of the greatest atrocities that occurred when we combined our medical cannabis ordinance with our Prop 64 adult use is that an adult use 15% excise tax at the state level got applied to all medical cannabis sales. And that is still a tremendous, burden that we're having to wrangle with in terms of what that does to access for low income and in high volume needs, patients. And that's really problematic, and only a legislative fix will remove that.
Yeah,
Great.
just to add, I agree. I think that, the medical and the recreational revenues have been blurred in the eyes of the consumer. They see a medical dispensary no different than a non-medical, so that it's all blurred together. Unfortunately, that's the situation for sure.
So I will call out, it's Ojai that has the measure, who actually does exempt gross receipts from medical cannabis. So
Okay.
Good job, Ojai.
Good job, Ojai.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you for that. Okay, great. Let's take a look at Encinitas real quick. Who wants to jump in here?
Well, I'll go first.
Take it away, Fran.
I think it's the perfect measure. They have cultivation, manufacturing, they go through the whole soup to nuts. And, from an industry's perspective, no additional local taxes is good. They're going to certainly receive sales and use tax or sales tax anyway because of their 1% Bradley Burns. So, I think that's probably quite commendable on their side, to do it just like that.
I think very important to note on this one is it's a citizens initiative. So you've got people who put this together. The people, thank you. Wanting some smart and fair policy. So
I think that goes back to James's point. Yep. Good job, folks.
And just to add to that, I think as we're looking for other cities as they start to go forward, whether they have a measure coming forward in November or a different time, they're going to look at all models. We constantly are asked, what are different scenarios that are good or bad? It's nice to have these type of analysis. They'll say, oh, so we wouldn't be the first one. Oh, citizens might do this. It's a good case study to have in the portfolio.
Absolutely. Okay, we're gonna pop ahead to La Alhambra. So this one's not looking great. Again, we've got allows for only 4 delivery license, which seems really limited. So maybe we can talk a little bit about limiting business growth for this one. If anyone wants to jump in. Fran, you want to take this one again?
Yeah, I mean, this one, I don't know a lot about it. Haven't been involved in this one, but to me, this is sort of like okay, we're gonna have to let something in. We're pressured. We don't really want the industry in. These drivers are coming in anyway. Let's try to put something in place. The reality is they're gonna have a difficult time collecting the tax. It's very hard to enforce, but I think that gives them some recourse from a law enforcement perspective to catch somebody and say, hey, you're not paying the tax. That's my 2 cents on that. Not a good one, obviously, from a business perspective.
Yeah. I also think too, some of the tax, you know, the broader tax evasion pieces are also coming into play on enforcement issues. So interesting dynamic there.
Yeah,
Any
I
other
would also, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, just for better or worse, none of these ones that we've covered so far seems to have an equity component to it either. So anywhere that you're seeing especially tight caps or these very limited licenses, not only is it good for business in general, it's going to be really bad for social equity or other people trying to enter into the industry.
Yeah, and I'd love to segue into that after our next one to talk specifically about social equity and tying it into tax measures. So Oceanside. James, you want to take this one? Did we do all the work for you? Oh, you're on mute, James.
Oops, sorry. I was just thanking Eddie for making this easy on us. Right, new taxes, all cannabis activity in the area. Again, max 6%, cultivation lower than that, 3.5. I will say one thing about this and one thing about the one we just looked at. You know, some cultivation taxes have been done on square footage, and I'll just note that in jurisdictions where there's an option to have either open field, you know, outdoor 100% natural light, or greenhouse, so-called mixed light, versus indoor, a square footage tax is going to heavily incentivize indoor high intensity lighting cannabis cultivation, just because they can flip so many more harvests out of that square foot. So that's something to think about at the policy level. One thing that I would suggest, if you're talking to your local government about the component of, well, you know, how many businesses should we have? You know, well, if you want a lot of taxes, you might want to have sort of more businesses reaching out into more parts of the state. And well, how will you know if it's the right number? Well, what's interesting is we've kind of gotten, you know, the most progressive, liberal, left-leaning, you know, coastal cities and counties are on board. So we're moving inland, right, into the Central Valley, up into the foothills, and into parts of the state. They're a little more conservative, or at least, you know, less liberal progressive, and they might be a little more libertarian, or they are going to possibly have at least a council member or two, if not a majority, who should be open to the argument that it is not the job of government to pick winners and losers, that is what the free market is for. And if you let the market operate, then we will know exactly how many cannabis businesses we will have, because all the ones we shouldn't have will go bankrupt and go out of business, and the other ones will continue to flourish and provide jobs and occupancy and secondary economic effects. It also kind of simplifies the system. You don't have to, you know, hire a consultant to do a complicated scoring system of, you know, well, who gets an A+ and who gets an A- and who do we pick, and, you know, did they have the prettiest layout for their application? So it's simpler, and I think it should appeal to that kind of free market, you know, makes sense, let the market decide. Don't set an artificial cap. And again, you might have a stronger argument there for supply chain than for storefront dispensary. They're always going to be more concerned about that. But that other stuff is completely invisible, and there should be no limits on any of it.
Thanks for your
before
input.
we move on, I wanted to call out, Pomona's got 2 dueling measures on the ballot, and one is based on zoning, like James was just explaining, and the other one, the council will set a limit on the number of businesses. So it'll be really interesting to see how the citizens of Pomona want to see that roll out. the fact sheet that compares it seems a little biased. Like if I had no idea what was happening and I read just the fact sheet, you'd be, oh, of course you want to go with the one that is the city council gets to dictate. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I like to see at least there is an option there for Pomona to make the choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that's great. We had an interesting question come in that I want to touch on real quick. We have a city council member on from King City, and they have a tax measure on the ballot for dispensary and distribution. They already have manufacturing and cultivation tax on the books, and they're looking to hear perspective on distribution taxation. They've heard some varying viewpoints. Anybody want to take a stab at that question? I thought it wove in nicely. 0 on distro?
0 for distribution. That's what the city of Santa Rosa does. That's where our business has most of our licenses, and it helps our business be able to stay alive. Having that piece of the distribution chain, the supply chain not taxed is really huge for us. Something that Santa Rosa has done right. And it's not that we don't pay taxes there, we pay normal business taxes for our distro. Right. So I feel like that's a very healthy place for it to be, King City.
Yeah, I think I would concur that the lower the better, or 0, because it's really the hub of all these other dynamics. If you're going to have other things, it's the bloodline for everything to flow through distribution, manufacturing and retail. It's just a key component. You don't want to penalize that. Without it, you're in trouble.
And I would also ask, how do you tax distribution companies in other industries in your area? And if they're and maybe do it accordingly. You know, how do you tax your food distributors? How do you tax other distributors in the area? Because really, as James was saying, you know, the way that the cannabis supply chain functions and that role in a community, it's not a very visible, it's not a storefront, it's not a high, you know, target crime scene. I think when we begin to kind of unwind the instinct to regulate this stuff like plutonium and tax it like it's an endless piggy bank, it's a good idea. And the simple math that I always kind of lay out when I'm talking about taxes is when we look at the fact that we have this probably 20% of cannabis in the licensed industry and 80% of what's going on isn't, the more we can welcome that activity into a licensed industry, we see that the demand is endless. Like there's no demand problem for access to cannabis. And if you would have the choice between taking, you know, 0.1% of $1 million or having 10% of $1 million or 0.1% of $1 billion, that's some of the things that I think localities should be looking at, is the more inclusive and the lower the tax rates and the more enticing to businesses, actually the more money you'll make. And many, you know, studies reveal this.
Right. And just to add to that, from a general fund taxing perspective, distribution business, you know, normally sales tax would be the way these type of businesses would be, but is it the place of sale? Probably not, because they're distributing from other locations. The only other place they'd really get taxed is property tax, of course, or a business license fee, that sort of thing. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense other than the normal property
well, I did
tax.
get a response that he said, heard you loud and clear, with a smiley face. Good to know. All right, let's talk a little bit about Ventura, and then I do want to hit on the social equity piece, and then we can talk a little bit about the GOTV stuff. So this one looks good. Thanks again, Eddie, for putting these slides together and making it easy for us. I think it's this one's really illustrating a lot of what we've already discussed and talked about. Smart approaches, encouraging new businesses to come in. I think that's all good.
This one it was interesting. I have a note on this measure that it's written really well, but this one has a component of both taxing and market expansion. So it's putting in the voters' hands how to expand their market, and that's a dangerous place where it does not create flexibility on the other side when the voters actually put in the standards. And on Ventura's, I've got a note that there's a 1,200-foot buffer from sensitive uses, which is pretty limiting. So, and when they realize that after this gets approved, it's going to be difficult for them to reduce that because it was approved by the voters. So there's a couple of measures that really detail out how the locals are going to regulate. And I think because it's such a difficult thing for locals to actually go through that process and involve the community and, you know, make everyone happy, which is impossible. But it is, there's one, I think it's Marina, has on the ballot, basically they're trying to adjust a voter initiative of an ordinance. So they went to the voters before and now they need to go back to the voters to be flexible. So
got it. That's a great point.
It's just an interesting note that I made. Yeah.
Thanks, Amber. That's great insight. Okay, well, let's transition a little bit. Julie, I'm going to kick it back over to you just to talk about some of the social equity components. I know you touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of how taxes and lack of access really contributes to barriers to entry, but would love for you to expand a little bit on that. Oh, I can't hear you.
Of course not, because I was muted. But as I was saying earlier, any time that we're talking about issues of local access or caps or restrictive ordinances, obviously that's just going to impact social equity even more. And as we said, all of these, it's always interesting for me to look at where the ordinance process begins with people. I think Fran was saying earlier kind of about it, almost inverting the values of what you're looking at when you're creating an ordinance, where right now what we see is everybody starts with the money. They all start with the taxes, and then from there they promulgate regulations. And I was just having a conversation earlier today that in my wonderfully naive and idealistic perfect world, I would love to see localities starting with social equity and then trickling down to talking about taxes and tax rates and those aspects, but we don't live there yet. We're here. So suffice it to say, the local access really impacts social equity communities. None of these ordinances that we're seeing so far, to my knowledge, have any mention or aspect of equity or carves out for equity or different tax rates for equity mentioned in the ordinance thus far. Also, when we were talking about those 548 local governments with only about a third of them with an ordinance, of those, on the BCC website right now, there are a total of 9 municipalities that have a social equity ordinance. So in the entire state of California and 548 local governments, there's only 9 social equity programs listed on the BCC site. We're starting to see some more coming on board. It's interesting because in the social equity grant fund report that's about 500 pages long, I'm sure you've read every word, that the BCC released, you know, they're releasing funds to municipalities that do not have their ordinances posted on the BCC site yet. So it's interesting to look at those funds that are being dispersed, and also funds being dispersed to municipalities to help with their development of a social equity program. Their report came out in July. One of the other issues for social equity is that the municipalities receiving this money, and it's $40 million that have been dispersed to local governments to supposedly, you know, go to social equity applicants to help with fee deferrals in the form of loans and grants or technical assistance. We don't have any visibility on how that money is being dispersed in the locality. So the localities don't have to report that to the state until January 1 of 2021. So I know, I mean, on the diversity, on the DICE committee within CCIA, you know, our big focus right now is on accountability for local governments in terms of what is happening with these funds, how are these funds reaching the social equity applicants, and how do we start looking at and rating those local ordinances and the local programs for their effectiveness. And I think that that's going to be a really important point of focus. And just actually one more thing, sort of tied to social equity, definitely, is that there's 2 other issues that I think kind of should be included in the equity conversation. One, which is that we still face the fact that indigenous peoples and tribal governments are completely excluded from the commercial cannabis industry in California, and that should be a part of that equity conversation as well. And that also, back in Prop 64, it called for a feasibility study for nonprofit license types. And originally the BCC was supposed to deliver that in January of 2018, and that date got punted by 2 years to January of 2020. They say that they have finished that report, but they still have not released any of their findings in terms of what is the feasibility of a nonprofit license type, which is very important to a lot of folks who may want to pursue that as a model.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up those two really important points, Julie. I really appreciate it. So obviously that's a whole other space that we could spend some time talking on, but we only have about 10 more minutes. So maybe a future webinar, we can take a look at some of those issues in greater depth. But I definitely think the social equity piece is huge to this conversation and really needs to be considered in a very thoughtful way. Fran, did you want to add in on that?
I just think I'm noticing there's a lot of inquiries coming our way into others around social equity, just to add that they're looking for help to implement a program and to fund it. So that's positive that cities are asking. Many of them are very large cities that are, in this area. So they're looking for the help from the experts. And I think that's a positive.
That's great. Well, and we certainly know that some of those social equity programs are working better than others. Right. So we can, if CCIA can be helpful in a subsequent conversation, just in terms of steering folks in a good direction, we'd be happy to do that.
That's great.
Okay, we have 8 minutes left. Send in questions if you have any. Appreciate everyone's ability to stick around with us while we wrap up here. So Amber, I wanted to kind of turn things over to you a little bit, because I thought in our preparations for this webinar, you had some really great points about it's not only what's on the ballot, it's who's on the ballot, and how can folks engage on that level with locals, or soon to be local.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to kind of go into that, and I'll try to be as concise as possible. But for NorCal, Santa Rosa's tax rate is coming up in July. They can adjust it again in July 2021. So being in that part of my job, I wanted to see what Santa Rosa's financial outlook looks like, and whether or not they'd be looking to cannabis in July, when they have the ability to change the rates, because they have one of the lowest rates in California now. And what I found was a great city council meeting. Everyone should be watching their city council meetings and really pay attention to the budget discussions they're having right now. So in Santa Rosa, they are going to be making some long-term budget decisions in 2021. They've hired a consultant who's basically putting together a menu of where the city can adjust, and they can either adjust revenues or expenditures. And one of the things that this consultant said a couple times was, "Oh, you guys are really low on your cannabis rates," which sent my flags up. And then that made me think, like, well, who adjusts our rates? And that's the city council. So in Santa Rosa, there's a 7-member council, and we have 4 seats up for election this in November. So what NorCal did was we reached out to every single one of the candidates to figure out if they knew anything about cannabis.
It looks like maybe Amber froze.
Yeah, let me, she did stimulate something for me.
Hey, Eddie, can Amber, are you still there? I think we're having some trouble with your connection.
I'm here.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
You cut out for like the last 20 seconds of what you were saying. Sorry.
So I'll get to my point. My point is basically, like, right now, all of the candidates will take your call. All of them want to hear from you. So right now is your opportunity to get out, to get in their ear that cannabis is not just about a tax. It's about what we bring to the community, way beyond just our taxes. We create a stable economic situation. And in Santa Rosa, we had the opportunity to talk with everybody. So we're feeling good that at least the conversation started on a good note going into 2021, where there's going to be some real hard budget conversations. So I encourage everybody to go out and talk to people right now.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. James, you want to touch on that? And then Fran?
Two quick things. One is you should absolutely present in an organized fashion both with a local trade group if possible, and certainly, you know, as a member of CCIA, you should refer local government to CCIA as a source of industry experience and knowledge. Amber inspired me with her reference to local budgets. A lot of cities run on a fiscal year from July to June, which means they're doing their budget in the spring, getting serious in February and March. Some of them run on a 2-year cycle. Oakland, for instance, is coming to the end of the cycle. And, you know, if you want to talk about social equity, cannabis and the war on drugs was a byproduct of racism in the United States, but it is not the cause or the source of the racism in the United States. And certainly one of the most egregious and apparent manifestations is law enforcement. And it is one thing to go to a protest or to put up a sign, and those are all great things, and you should do those things. It is another thing to go down to City Hall and say, we need to look at what this city did as part of the war on drugs and how much money we spent here historically and how much money we are going to put into addressing some of the harm of the war on drugs that we caused here locally, probably with our law enforcement, which, you know, is a possible source of some of that funding. And if you want to get fancy and throw cannabis in the mix, by all means, I'm sure you'll find a way to do that.
I love that call. Thank you, James. All right, Fran, and then Julie, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
Yeah, just real briefly, I think, you know, in light of the COVID pandemic, cities, counties, everyone's feeling the impacts of closures. One thing I think that shouldn't be lost sight is the fact that cannabis sales tax revenues across the board, the cannabis arena, are doing very, very well. It's somewhat recession resistant. Obviously, dispensaries are open. So I think that's important to remind folks that, you know, cannabis is contributing a great deal, not just to jobs and generation, but it's revenues coming through sales tax, not just these specific cannabis taxes, especially right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Fran.
Of course.
Julie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, when you are looking at those local ballots, sometimes things that really impact cannabis are hiding where you may not expect them. I mean, I think one of the great successes for CCIA in the state this year was the passage of SB 223, which is known as JoJo's Act, which permits school boards to adopt policies to allow parents and caregivers to give their children medicine at school. And obviously that decision is on the school board, and the school board is an elected position. So you may not tie that one to cannabis policy, but for example, in Los Angeles right now, there's 4 school board seats up for grabs in this election cycle. And it's important for people, especially parents that have children or that need medicinal cannabis, to make sure they know where their school board stands on cannabis. So it's important on every level of every elected official, even if you think it's related or not, to know where they stand, but also that there's tremendous value in them taking those calls that Amber, as she said, they'll take it right now, and that they see and experience a constituency who is consistently curious and values where they stand on cannabis.
That's a great point. Very much appreciated. Last couple moments here, I do want to say that next Wednesday, we are going to be hosting a special membership meeting at noon. We're going to have some special guests, some electeds stopping by, talking a little bit about the election and important information that you all should know. So if you're a CCIA member, stay tuned for an invite noon next Wednesday. All this other stuff you guys know: to vote, get yourself registered, make sure you've got your act together. I do want to note that CCIA has been tracking all of the local measures that have to do with cannabis. You can find that on our resource page on our website. Huge thank you to Philo and Cannaregs, again, invaluable partners in this process. We linked up with Cannaregs in 2018 to do something similar. We got amazing feedback from our members saying how useful it was to be able to go up and look at the ordinances and be able to get informed and educated on what's happening in their community. So big ups to Cannaregs again for stepping in, and we really love partnering with you all. And then also this amazing group that I really wish I was sitting in a room with, because y'all are some of my favorites. But alas, we have to do it online. So Amber, James, Fran, and Julie, thank you so much. And thanks to Eddie for all the behind the scenes help with all of this and his insight. And yeah, thanks everybody. We really appreciate your support of CCIA, and we hope you found this information valuable. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank
Go
you.
vote. All right. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy birthday, Eddie.
Eddie, you can cut it now.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to end it. You guys can hop off if you want.
The Zoom call that keeps going. It's the Zoom that keeps going.
I
All right, well,
know.
we can log everybody off. You can all hang up. How about
Yeah,
that?
feel free.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
I
Bye-bye.
Slowly figuring out how to hang up. What am I doing?